Emilie, you shared this question. How can we ignite a culture of care and kindness in our workspaces and communities? How can we be present and show empathy without taking too much space? And how can we be at the service of others without being passive to the point of being useless as an ally, work peer, or leader? So, Emilie, what do you want to think about?
Some big questions there. Well, I think it was prompted, and it may be worth sharing the example that prompted some of these questions. We're in another great dialogue with some other women in social finance, which was really fascinating to me because it was a discussion around individuals' experience of racism. Mm-hmm. And there's a very human desire that I sort of felt and witnessed within that group of the desire from people who have not experienced racism directly to empathise with that experience. And so to bring in their own experiences, perhaps around other forms of discrimination, perhaps that they may have been on the receiving end of. And I realised in that discussion, and I've seen it happen before, there's a sense of the risk of in doing so, either minimizing that person's experience or seeking to sort of co-opt that person's experience. And yet, how do you channel, I suppose, that desire to empathize, to actively listen, to be a supportive ally? And I think, that was that example, but I think that can show up in lots of different areas of life and dialogue. And so it was something that I was reflecting on how to do that, to be an active ally, essentially. And I think, through showing that kindness and caring, and that was what prompted some of these reflections.
And what more do you think or feel or want to say?
I think on that, it then prompted a good discussion, I think, between us. And I always really appreciate your prompting and your questions around this. So thank you once again for inviting me into this discussion. I always feel like I get sort of learn or get some illumination through it. So thank you. But I think it prompted some thoughts about how as an active listener, be how much you are in service. So that's you're an illustration of that, Savannah, but that's you're in service to others. And that in and of itself can be enough and can actually be hugely powerful without having to come with solutions, without having to come with answers, without having to propose, and here's what we do next. There's absolutely, no need for that. Often just being that active listener can be very much of service to others in all forms of dialogue and connection.
Be in service to others. And what more does this thinking brings up in you?
Well, I suppose it's a good challenge then as to how to show up in that way. Mm-hmm. In many of the interactions that we have day to day, whether that's, connecting to someone walking along the street or in a very intentional way in a meeting or in a conversation with a friend, you can think about how, I think, not to underestimate the potential power of just showing up and listening to other people and what that can unlock and how that can be, hugely constructive in and of itself without it's not a passive act in a sense.
So what would you be able to be or do or feel more of that we could maybe think about in this time that we have together?
Oh, I suppose there's also a part of letting go of needing to accomplish anything.
Letting go.
It doesn't have to be always I'm making this intervention in order to get to this point. It's not like a linear sequence of if I do this, then this happens. Mm-hmm. So actually altogether letting go of needing to accomplish anything and not knowing where that act will go. It doesn't really matter. It's the power of the act in and of itself.
So there was something about showing up and letting go.
Yeah, it maybe feels sometimes, that's a good point. It can feel like it's not inconsistent. They're not mutually exclusive. They can work very powerfully together.
So, Emilie, what do you think is in the way of showing up and letting go?
I suppose there's a lot of us. Well, I for one can speak of, spending an inordinate of time either thinking about what's happened or what might happen, rather than just being, present in the moment. And I think one of those barriers to letting go, for me at least, is, we have lots of thoughts running through all our heads, and you're always thinking about what next and what needs to happen and what you might desire as an outcome. But that's the challenge, to let that go, to just, be in the moment, be of service to others, and trust that, we're in the house of trust, and trust that that is probably more than enough, oftentimes.
So I just want Burning to ask again, what else might be in the way of us of you maybe showing up and letting go?
I suppose there is an opportunity there for the work to do on myself, on ourselves, around when you're showing up, being conscious about how you're showing up. Are you ready to be in that moment? Are you still thinking about what's just happened? Or, you mentioned sort of running from things to things. Often the diary can be quite busy with things back to back, and you're still sort of half thinking about what you've just been doing when you kind of come into another space. So I suppose there's the work for us to be mindful of how we show up in the moment, and how, that presencing. I think I was reading something about sort of, what's it called, absencing versus presencing, and how the energy that you bring can suck energy out of a room if you're not careful, just in the way that you show up. So how can you ground yourself in that sort of presencing rather than absencing? So being aware of the energy you bring, and how you turn up in any given moment through any interaction. And of course, we're not wholly rational beings at all. So, there's all sorts of things going on with each of us at any point in time. And I suppose just being cognizant of that, and owning it if you turn up in not quite the right mood, and owning that, and by owning that I mean being reflective of it. And then if it hasn't quite gone as you wanted, or you've not quite turned up in the spirit you intended, there's power in just acknowledging that as well, and sometimes apologizing, essentially. Maybe I'm thinking too much of my children here, but
Oh, what are they what's coming up for you when you're thinking too much of your children?
Yeah, just thinking like, as a busy mum, the importance of clearing your headspace before showing up for them as well, as much as possible. I mean, it applies to everyone, but I suppose it certainly applies to my children.
Wow. And Emilie, I'm just going to ask again, what else might be in the way? What else do you think might be in the way of you showing up and letting go, which come into pairs?
Probably many things, but I suppose I'm trying to clear my mind a little even in this conversation. So nothing more coming immediately to the fore.
So you listed a couple of things in the past minutes, and what's most in the way, do you think, of showing up and letting go for you?
Well, I suppose it is that I think we touched on before, just trying to remove, when I mean sort of clearing things, it's in that presencing is in order to remove as much as possible the ego in the connection or the conversation. So the fact that when you're showing up, it's not about you. The idea of being in service to others. That's what I'm meaning, I suppose, in relation to clearing things before engaging with my young children as much as possible. It's not about me turning up to it, it's about me being of service to them. And I think that applies to, as I said, many different contexts and lots of different interactions. So as much as possible, they're all kind of ego-driven creatures, I'm sure, is to remove that as much as possible. And I think, going right back to the beginning of the conversation, one of the challenges in that desire to empathize is you are putting how to do that without putting your ego in the way of the listening or the I don't know if that's making sense, but in those kind of dialogues, when someone's sharing a really personal experience with you, how to remove the ego in the response to that. not make it about yourself, but even in that reaction, but it's about honoring what they've shared with you. And that can apply not just in that example of sort of sharing, difficult experiences of racism, say, but it can apply in lots of different contexts of where someone's sharing something with you.
So there's that thing around empathy, and as one of our guests pointed before, is that the empathy, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, will never happen. So how do you connect all these things? You said removing the ego, listening, be present, showing up. But what's all the connection there?
Good question. I think there's an element of back to the concept of trust. It's an important brick, I think, in that building of any relationship or any connection is, am I trusting that someone's really listening to, really hearing me, and not just jumping to their own experience or their own, which comes from a well-meaning place, that can create a barrier at the same time. It's something I've certainly experienced, and not through any malice or bad intention on the part of the other, but when someone seeks to immediately try and empathize with, and you're thinking, actually, did you really hear me? Did you really hear what I was saying? And I was expressing a feeling through that experience rather than just an experience for you to then share with me your experience. So it's, I think, just trying to be, continuously be challenged by this, I'm sure, but continue to try and challenge myself around that in those sorts of interactions. To think, oh, hang on, that didn't feel great when someone did this to me as well. I do remember that. It's a human desire to empathize and share your experiences, but sometimes it can get in the way of the conversation that's trying to be had.
Wow. Well, that sounds like a bomb if we now come and say empathy can be really, really, really have a sort of negative impact here, or empathy as we know it. What do you think?
I don't know. I suppose I'd have to go back and look up empathy. I think maybe I'm misinterpreting it. Maybe that's not fair. But I think it has its place, but it is a very important and powerful human way to react to things. But I think there's ways that can be done well, and ways that can be done in a way that takes away from the connection sometimes.
So am I hearing that there is a place for being with someone, listening to their story, not having the urgency to share our own story to show that we understand, but having that kind of detachment, and being detached not as such of not caring.
Yeah, it's detachment, but I don't know what the word is. It's a good challenge. Is it detachment? Is it because in a way that is caring? Because it's not disinterest. It's not necessarily even a lack of empathy. I think it's just ways and means of how to respond appropriately or adequately. And sometimes silence can be extraordinarily powerful in that. A sort of intentional silence and engaged silence, if that makes sense.
Wow. So, Emilie, at the beginning, you wanted to ask yourselves, how can we be present and show empathy without taking too much space? And you also, how can we be at the service of others without being passive to the point of being useless as an ally, work, peer, or leader? And I wonder, how far are you right now?
Always feels like at the foothills. Always at the foothills of that. But it's really good to talk with you about it, because it takes it to that next level of reflection on how we can all show up and with intent and with caring intent.
So if you had one question you wanted to shape or build for yourself, to take away in your little handbag to explore, as you're now on that thinking journey, what question would you ask yourself now?
Maybe a bit ironic given how much I've just spoken, but maybe, where and how to use that really active silence.
Where and how to use that very active silence. Well, thank you. I'll be, with your permission, I'll be asking you what you find out along the way and, in a few days, weeks. Thank you so much, Emilie.
Yes, please. Thank you, Simran. Thank you so much.
Thank you.